Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan Guru-Murthy, and this is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. My guest this week has changed the way we think about trees. Professor Suzanne Simard is Professor of Forest Ecology at the University of British Columbia in Canada. She is author of the book Finding the Mother Tree, and her work has influenced other scientists, but modern culture, popular art, James Cameron, the tree in the movie Avatar, the Tree of Souls. A lot of that comes from her work, which tells us that trees are not just singular things that you can chop down with no consequence, but communicate, help each other, maybe even recognize their own offspring. Suzanne, welcome.
Thank you.
And you're here actually because you're collecting the Kew International Medal in London, so congratulations on that.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a great honor.
I mean, first of all, explain in better terms than I just did what your work is really about.
Well, I look at how connection is important in forests. So like you said, we used to think of trees as just individuals that, try to get their needs met by competing for light, water, nutrients. And trees, we've long known, also form symbioses with fungi, a group of fungi called mycorrhizal fungi. And this has been known for quite a long time, but it was here in the UK that Sir David discovered in the laboratory that little seedlings could actually be connected together by these mycorrhizal fungi, that they could trade actually carbon. And so what I did is I asked, does this happen in the forests of Canada? And in Canada, we have big forests, big old growth forests with trees that can be 50 meters tall. And I thought, wow, I wonder if this is also occurring in our forest. So I did some field work, field studies in my doctoral research, and I discovered that actually these trees in these forests will actually send carbon back and forth between them through these mycorrhizal networks that join the trees together. And then I continued on with many graduate students to unfold that story and really build it out.
What do you mean by a common mycorrhizal network?
It's below ground. And so a mycorrhiza is an association between a fungus and a tree. So it's a special kind of fungi. There's thousands of these species around the world, but they form this symbiosis where the tree provides photosynthate or energy in exchange for nutrients and water that the fungus gathers from the soil in its mycelium. What a common mycorrhizal network is when that fungus, those fungi, it can be many fungi actually, that link these different trees together below ground. It's kind of like a web where roots are joined together. So that's called a common mycorrhizal network.
And when you say they move carbon, what are they moving? Is it sugars or what is it?
Yeah, so I actually use isotopes, carbon-13 and carbon-14, to trace how carbon moves through these networks. I'm not a biochemist and I don't look at the actual compounds, although we've tried to piece together what the compounds are. It's most likely not carbohydrates, but rather amino acids. And so carbon that's associated with nitrogen in simple amino acids like glutamate that moves from one tree to another through this fungal network.
So why would trees move nutrients from one to another?
Well, so trees are in a community. They grow together, and there's a lot of diversity in forests, diversity that can be structural diversity, even if it's all one species. You have trees of different sizes, big tall ones, small ones, intermediate ones. You can have a number of species that fix or photosynthesize at different rates, or acquire nitrogen from the soil at different rates. And so in that way, it's a very uneven resource field, if you will. There's some rich trees and some poor trees. And so what happens is that nutrients and carbon and water will move from tree to tree and in essence, redistribute resources. And this helps with the diversity and the regenerative capacity of the forest.
Because when I was at school and we were learning about the treetop canopy and rainforests, we were basically told trees all just compete with each other. When there's a hole in the canopy, they race for the sunlight. Some die, some win,
Yeah.
You're saying that's all wrong?
No, I'm not saying that's all wrong. I'm saying the picture was incomplete. And so trees do still compete. They still can shade their neighbors. They can still acquire water for themselves. But at the same time, they can also redistribute and share these resources. And so it's a much more sophisticated relationship between trees and other plants than we once thought.
Now, in your TED Talk, which I would recommend to everybody, it's brilliant and it's had millions of listeners. I mean, you say trees talk. What does that mean?
Well, okay, so in my TED Talk, Ted said trees talk. What it means is that they're in communication. So they're not literally talking like you and I are talking through our mouths. They're communicating in different ways. And the way I look at it is how these resources, water, nutrients, carbon-based molecules move from plant to plant. They're basically sending resources and in some cases information back and forth between them. And to me, that's a type of communication.
When you say information, I mean, what is that information?
So there's two things that I've studied regarding information, not just these resources. So one is in greenhouses, we've actually injured plants that are forming a common mycorrhizal network. They're linked together by a fungus, and we'll injure one plant, so pull off its needles, infest it with an insect that chews its needles, and that tree goes into a stress response. And the tree will then upregulate and produce defense enzymes, and the neighboring tree is eavesdropping or listening in on that tree and receives the message, and it upregulates its own defense enzyme production and protects itself against that injury. So that is kind of a defense communication. The other kind of communication is that we've also studied how in Douglas fir that Douglas fir trees will communicate with each other, and I don't know the exact mechanism, but about their relatedness. So whether or not they're in kinship with a neighbor or if it's a stranger neighbor. And that is expressed through changing the morphology and fitness traits of the neighboring plant that is receiving that kinship information.
Right. What is the mother tree?
So the mother tree is really the biggest, oldest trees in the forest. It's not necessarily a particular species. It's just the most prominent trees. And so they're the ones that have big crowns, high photosynthetic capacity, and they send a lot of energy and nutrients into the soil. And then that is actually transmitted through the forest that can be used to drive nutrient cycles, the carbon cycle, water cycle, and even help the regenerative capacity of the forest. Just to try to imagine what this looks like in the UK, and you think about your transportation system, the train system, and the underground system, you have some big stations and then smaller stations. And so the mother tree or the hub tree is the one that's the big station, like King's Cross, for example.
Right, but you've also introduced the idea of trees recognizing offspring.
Yes.
So just explain that.
Yes. So I had two graduate students and a postdoc, Brian Pickles, Monica Gorzalak, and Amanda Asay, who did their research at UBC on kin recognition in Douglas fir. And we worked with the top kin recognition plant scientist in Canada, Dr. Susan Dudley. And we investigated whether Douglas fir could recognize its kin. And where that came from is we knew that Douglas fir in these forests with the mother trees, that they were able to facilitate or help the regeneration of seedlings around them. And so we asked, could they actually detect, and favor which ones were from their own seed? And so we conducted a series of greenhouse experiments and field experiments where we grew seedlings with full siblings that we had grown from seed with strangers, and we had them connected together through their mycorrhizal networks or isolated. And we found that when two siblings grew together, that one of the siblings was able to recognize the other and build better root systems, bigger mycorrhizal networks, and actually it changed their growth traits as well. And so it really was a selective process where the seedling's fitness, its fitness traits were enhanced. And when we added on more and more neighbors, more and more strangers in different densities, it actually enhanced those traits. We carried that on, and we asked the question too, if one of those seedlings was injured by a western spruce budworm, would it enhance its kin recognition? And we found that it actually did.
I mean, it's all sort of pretty mind-blowing stuff. I mean, does this apply to, well, can you be sure it applies to anything beyond the Douglas fir?
Whether this happens in other places in the world, I would say that there's a high chance that it does, based on other people's research where they've looked at whether using various techniques, whether fungi will be shared between different plants and different species, whether they might form a network. It's likely that they do, but the depth of research in all these other places around the world isn't as much as what we've done in our home forests. And I would say that there's a value in studying deeply a forest type because you learn so much in such detail about what's going on.
So where did your love of trees come from?
Well, I grew up in the inland rainforests of British Columbia. These are, forests of cedars and hemlocks and yew trees in the understory and lush shrubs like salmonberry and thimbleberry, rivers running through, salmon running through the rivers. Salmon is through the forest, which is, has such an influence on the productivity of these incredible forests. So I grew up in a family that had emigrated from France and my mother's side from Britain. Back in the 1600s, actually, a long time ago, moved across Canada and became horse loggers. And so I grew up in a horse logging family, and I would follow along my grandfather and my uncle and dad. And
what is a horse logger?
So a horse logger is someone who cuts trees by hand. It's selective harvesting, so taking 1 or 2 trees out of a hectare of forest, for example. And once the tree is felled back in the day, it was hand falling or with a chainsaw later on, and then hooking up that big log, and some of these logs were very big, to a horse with various chains and a wiffle board, which is something that hung out at the back of the horse to prevent the chain from hurting the horse, and the horse would pull the logs over to the flume, and flumes were big wooden troughs that my grandfather built that wound down the mountain full of water, and so the horses would pull those, and they would use pike poles to put those logs into the flume, and it would swoosh down into the lake below, and then it would be moved across the lake and then sent down the river, down the chucks, they called it.
So how do you go from a family history of chopping down trees to wanting to discover how they live and what's below the ground?
Yeah, so I grew up in this family where, it was a living for us. It was a way of life. And when my ancestors cut trees, it was just 1 or 2. And what I saw was the forest as a regenerative place. The forest rebounded in these little gaps that were made in the forest by cutting down individual trees. And so that's what I knew and loved. I knew the forest was this incredible place that could just rebound after that. And then I became a forester in my 20s, and I learned about industrial forestry, which was completely different than what I'd learned. It was about cutting down all the trees in the forest, not just 1 or 2 selected. It wasn't about cutting down trees. It was about cutting down whole forests. And the plantations that I was charged with as a young student to put back in place of these old-growth forests were not doing well. They were, subject to infections. Now we're seeing them burn down at higher rates than other parts of the forest. They became infested with insects. And so I started to look at, well, what are we doing? We're disconnecting these forests. We're kind of unraveling them. And we didn't really understand how they were connected. And so that got me studying these fungal networks below ground, which to me, looking in the soil was the natural place for me to go because I was always a kid of the dirt. I always ate dirt when I was a kid, and so it was natural for me to look below ground. And what I found was this incredible world of connectivity and activity of all these creatures that are working with each other, eating each other, driving the nitrogen cycle, driving the carbon cycle. It was fascinating.
I mean, obviously, the way you talk about it and the language you use, whether it's mother tree and siblings and communication and nutrients and all of these things, just, they inevitably lead you down a road of anthropomorphizing trees or thinking of trees at least as much closer to animals. How do you think of trees?
Well, I think of trees as very social creatures. I think of them as responsive and perceptive. I think of them as trees that grow amongst and beside each other for hundreds of years, that have relationships with each other. They have behaviors, they have memory, they make decisions. They have a lot of qualities of people and animals.
And because again, when you use those words, perception, memory, decisions, we think of the mind.
Yes.
You don't think trees have minds, do you?
No, but they have patterns below the soil. So when we studied the architecture of the mycorrhizal network, what emerged was what's called a complex system, or you can think of it as a biological neural network pattern, where there are strong hubs and smaller nodes that are linked in multiple ways. And our brains and a lot of are built that way. They have that same architecture. In fact, a lot of biological systems have that kind of architecture. Even river systems and watersheds have that kind of architecture, where there are rivers that connect landscapes together with large watersheds linking small watersheds, and then having streams that come out that feed the larger ocean. And so these neural network patterns are common across nature. We emulate them in our own human environments and our built systems as well, because they're very efficient at moving things around, and they're very resilient to changes and damage to that network.
Do you talk to trees?
I go hiking in the forest every day at home, and I always go to trees. I pat them on the bark, and I thank them for being there for all of us.
And do you think, why do you do that? Do you do that for you? Or do you think there's a communication there?
There probably is a communication there. I do it for me. But trees are living amongst all kinds of creatures all the time. Squirrels, pollinators, butterflies, birds, animals, bears live in trees where I live. Why wouldn't they have a communication with those other creatures? To me, it's like, why not?
So how do you feel because your work is now sort of seeped into popular culture. You're mentioned on, in TV series, and of course in Ted Lasso, and of course in James Cameron's Tree of Souls. How do you feel about the Tree of Souls? Because is that kind of idea of a tree really with feeling and soul and fourth senses and all those sorts of things helpful to you or not, or does it actually make the work of scientists harder because it'll be mocked?
Yeah, certainly it can be mocked. However, I think we need to move beyond that, because what it does is it makes us have better relationship with nature, because we understand trees and systems like forests as connected places. I think that's really essential as we move towards being closer to nature, because we really are in a global crisis right now with global change, and one of the key solutions is going to lie within our relationship to nature. And I think that moving into popular culture, even though sometimes the science gets misinterpreted or misheard, I think that it really has raised the awareness of the importance of forests in the world. And we really need to understand this, because we're losing forests to clear cutting for wood products and oil and gas and minerals at a really rapid rate at a time when we really need to protect our forests. So to me, it's important that we have these avenues of communication that includes art, it includes music, it includes poetry and books, so that we have all kinds of ways of informing ourselves about our relationship with forests.
So we have to stop seeing trees as just sort of commodities which can be, if you chop a tree down, it doesn't matter if you plant another one. If you just in this country in the last week, we've had a big controversy in a town on the south coast where the council chopped down a load of trees to redevelop a part of the city centre, and it caused huge controversy, and it was stopped. And the council's defence was, but we're planting many more trees than we're chopping down. Now, from what you're saying, that's not a straightforward defence.
No, it's not. Just to bring home how important forests are, in terrestrial ecosystems, they store 80% of the world's carbon as mature forests. And every time we chop down a forest of mature trees, we're releasing first we're releasing all the carbon associated with that tree, maybe turning it into products, but most of it is not. Most of it gets within 25 years is back into the atmosphere. We've lost the sequestration capacity of that tree until a new tree can then reach of that great age. A lot of soil carbon is released at that time through the disturbance of the soil. And so, at this time when we need to be drawing down CO2, cutting down mature forests is exactly the wrong direction that we should be going in. And it's going to take decades, if not hundreds of years, for those seedlings that are replanted to regain that carbon status again in the ecosystems. The other thing about old trees is that they're homes for biodiversity. There are certain species that only grow on old trees. Certain fungal species, certain bird species, certain animal species only will have habitat in old trees. And so as soon as those old trees are gone, so too are those organisms. So we have to be so careful when we think about cutting down old or mature trees. The consequences ecologically are huge. And obviously, through this reaction, the consequences socially are huge too, because people love trees. We feel healthy around trees. We feel joyful. We feel emotional health and joy. So I think that we really need to be more cognizant now, especially moving forward with global change when we're considering cutting down mature forests.
Tree planting is obviously a huge part of the global strategy around climate change. So how much do we know then about, planting the right trees, creating the right forests?
Yeah, it's going to take a lot of research and a lot of attention paid to this question, but climate is changing. And so it's kind of a moving platform, if you will, so that the target is constantly changing. And so, yes, there's knowledge about what species belong to a certain place, but that species might not belong there, anymore. So, for example, I understand that the UK used to have beech trees, but beech trees might not be well adapted to the emerging climate. Oak trees are a little more flexible, and so that they would be a good species to be replanting. But you'd have to think about the genotype of those oaks as well. Some are not very well adapted to drought, and they might die during a particularly hot spell or dry spell. And so you've got to be constantly monitoring, changing, modeling, and when the trees are planted, tending them, caring for them, making sure that they've got the best head start possible, and planting around old plants or old trees and legacies in the forest, legacies being good soil, good cover from old trees, natural pollinators. All of that needs to be taken into consideration to give those trees the best chance possible.
I suppose it's about people recognizing the relationship they have and have always had. Yeah. With plants and trees.
Yes.
And what we've got from plants and trees. In your own life, you've written about how your cancer drug came from trees.
Yeah.
And how that changed your own work and research. Could you just explain that?
Yeah, so I got breast cancer in 2012, and I was treated with paclitaxel, which is a chemical from the yew tree. It's actually produced in the cambium of the yew tree. And so when I was going through chemotherapy, and it was very hard on me, I would take my children and we would go out to our forest where because we have a lot of yew trees in our forests, and I would just commune with those trees at the time. And so every day I would try to go to the forest and do that and thank the trees for the medicine they provided me. But after that, I also I have a graduate student, her name is Eva, and Eva is studying how you grow yew trees in community with cedars and maples because they connect together below ground through arbuscular mycorrhizal networks, and whether or not the community, the forest health affects the chemistry, the medicines that the yew tree produces, the paclitaxel. Because my hypothesis is that a healthy forest will produce a healthy yew tree, which will produce more medicinal, better medicines. And I will note, too, that Taxol is a medicine for the yew tree itself. It's actually a defense enzyme for that tree. It's a long-lived tree. It lives for thousands of years in some cases. And because of that, it needs to defend itself against all kinds of insects and pathogens. And so it's created, or it's evolved, this highly sophisticated chemistry for defending itself, which actually works for defending us as well against cancers. And so to me, it's like giving back to the yew tree, trying to find out more about it and how to make sure that it grows in a healthy community so it can reciprocate and help us as well. So it's like a reciprocal thank you to the yew tree for helping me live.
I mean, for all you say about how we love trees, and most of us do, I suppose our urbanized ways of living have accentuated this disconnection from trees, hasn't it? So what can we learn from the people who really live amongst the trees, Indigenous people around the world?
Well, one thing about Indigenous people that is very, is a common thread throughout, and just note that we're all Indigenous at some point. And so we all have this very strong connection to Mother Earth. And Indigenous people, especially to this very day, that is the underlying philosophy and worldview, is to honor and protect and look after Mother Earth. And in return, Mother Earth will look after us. And so through culture and ceremony and practices of looking after the land, that is all expressed, and it's all it is a underlies all of the caring and practices that they have. In the last couple of 100 years, as we've, our populations have expanded, we've become more and more exploitive, very consumptive instead of, regenerative. And so when we change our worldview back to being the caretakers, or to be, looking at our responsibilities to look after this incredible place, which is Mother Earth, then we change what we do. We care for the forests. We don't take from them. We reciprocate with them. We give back. We make sure they're healthy to provide healthy homes for people again, and all the other creatures. And we start to see all these other creatures as our relations, right? That we're all connected together as one. And there's many in the Indigenous nations where I live, they all have a word for that. We are all connected together. For example, in the Nechonlith nation, which is on the outer coast of Vancouver Island, they have a word called Hishishtuak, and that means we're all one together. Or the Coast Salish, Netsamas, we are all together. Or the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation, which is Uwinyakola, which means the land and the sea are connected. And so in the language, in the culture, in our own persons, then we need to re-embrace this connection, and then we will care for Mother Earth as our own.
How do you think we can then actually properly learn from Indigenous people, on a proper level? Because at the moment, sort of around the world, the relationship between most of the population and Indigenous people is a negotiation over rights to land.
Yeah.
It's about confining them to spaces, or exploiting where they live, digging mines and then moving them somewhere else and saying, well, what's the problem? Here's another bit of forest. How do you think that actual, because that's a relationship perhaps almost as disconnected as our relationship with trees.
Yes, I mean, it's really important that we restore rights and title to Indigenous territories. So right now, the rights of nature, which includes people, is ignored. And so this exploitation continues on. And we can't afford, in this time of rapid climate change, for that to happen. We have, within the next 10 years, to make major adjustments in how we manage land, how we decarbonize our energy sector, to draw down CO2, to avoid this 1.5 degree Celsius threshold where, climate change will be catastrophic. And the way that we'll make that work is to revitalize our connection with the land, and the Indigenous territories and nations have shown us how to do that. So if you look worldwide at where the biggest carbon stocks are, where the most biodiversity is, where the best hydrologic systems are, they're in Indigenous territories. They're not in these industrial landscapes. And so that's what we need to get back to. So how do we do that? We work together in that kind of ethos to combine or to enhance, I guess, the knowledge systems, each part of the knowledge systems, use each of the Western knowledge as well as Indigenous knowledge to create new knowledge that will help us adapt to climate change.
I mean, the idea of nature rights is really interesting, isn't it? I mean, we're all familiar with human rights. We're increasingly familiar with animal rights or welfare. Are you saying that regardless of climate change, it's not just about self-preservation, there is such a thing as the rights of nature.
Well, one thing about indigenous knowledge systems is that human beings are not the top of the pinnacle, right? Human beings are not superior. We're one of many. We're one of all relations, and we are part of nature. And so human rights are really nature's rights. And if humans are to thrive and be productive and reproduce and have generations after generations, we need to restore those rights to our non-human relations so that they can thrive and provide, sustain our whole life system. So it's all entwined together. I don't think we can separate these things apart.
Now, in the last month or so, some of your work has come under criticism, and it's quite an insight into sort of the internecine world of academia, because these are other academics in Canada who have criticised your work and have said it's, you don't have the evidence to support your ideas. Without going into the detail of the academic criticism, which most people won't understand, I guess, what is your response to the basic critique?
They have their points, right? They're looking at they're mycologists. They're looking at the fungi and very detailed reductionist kind of science that's very much focused on the small connections in the soil. And I'm an ecologist, and I look at systems, and I see the system as a connected system, and I've mapped these fungal connections in the forest. And to me, it's about looking at that holistic system.
Because one of the things they've said, for example, is that it might not be that the nutrients are flowing through the network. They might be flowing through the soil or other mechanisms.
They do flow through various mechanisms, and I've never said that they don't, right? They flow through the common mycorrhizal network, they flow through the soil, they flow from root tip to root tip, they flow through the air, for Pete's sakes. And so to me, it's about, looking at this whole system and these multiple modes of communication that allows the ecosystem and the community to thrive. And when we ignore those relationships, because really a forest is built on relationships, if we don't understand the intricacies and the sophistication of those relationships, we make all kinds of mistakes, and we have made a lot of mistakes.
They're quite critical, though, as well, of the sort of the way your work has been taken up by popular culture, and how ideas and anthropomorphizing trees, if you like, is a result of that. When you read this kind of criticism, I mean, is it all just part of that's academia, or do you take it personally, or how do you feel about it?
It is part of academia to be critical and to review, and I think that's a very strong part of science. That's how we move forward. Peer review is like the hallmark of science. In this case, it was very critical, particularly about my work. So I was taken aback, I have to say. But I realized that as a culture, global culture, we've come to understand that ecosystems are whole systems and that we need to embrace this, and that we don't need to go back and re-litigate these little tiny connections and say, oh, it's not a connected system. I think we've moved on from that, and that we need to now move on to looking at solutions.
Okay, well, let's just briefly come to that then. I mean, how you go from your work and what people like you to policy, hard policy for governments. What do you think the priority is right now? If the government called you in and said, look, what are the 3 things we should do? Do you have a list?
I do, actually. What our economy drives deforestation, right? Our desire for resources like wood products and oil and gas and minerals under the forest. And we value that above all else, right? Let's get, really wealthy on these resources. And we've ignored the very life support systems that produce those resources. We've ignored the relationships that build a whole healthy ecosystem. We've kind of torn them apart and said they don't matter. And we're going to rebuild this system in our own image to make it economically wealthy for us again. It doesn't work that way, right? Ecosystems are complex systems. And so I would say the first thing is to reevaluate how we value these resources, for their life support systems, the ability to clean water and provide clean air and to store carbon. and to be home to biodiversity that we need. That's the first thing, is to revalue these ecosystems so that it's more realistic. I mean, economic models have always put that into something called externalities and then ignored it. We need to embrace that and put it right into the economic models. The second thing that we need to do is we need to, in that process, revalue, not just how we value it, but the amount that we value it by. So, for example, we have too much carbon in our atmosphere. That's suddenly becoming something we need to put a price on. We need to put a price on greenhouse gases, carbon in particular. When we put a realistic price on carbon, it changes the economic picture, right? And right now, the price is rising high enough that it actually makes more sense to leave forests standing than to cut them down, because we're valuing the carbon and all the life associated with that more than we are the products that ends up on a ship going off somewhere else. We need to, in particular, products like wood pellets. It doesn't make sense from an ecological or social point of view to be taking forests and turning them into wood pellets to generate energy that has got a lower energy efficiency than other forms of green energy, for example. And then the next thing is we need to take those damaged ecosystems, and believe me, in Canada, where I live in British Columbia, there's vast areas of forests that have been converted from old forests to plantations. They have low biodiversity, low carbon storage, they're not very healthy. Is to go in and restore those forests, to make them diverse again by working with the forest with our hearts and our hands. And the way to do that is to work with local communities and local Indigenous nations, getting back into the land, working with the plants like we know them, reinvigorating these forests so that they're drawing down CO2 again, creating jobs, that are joyful jobs being in the forest, that where old and young people work together to work with the land and work with the salmon, bring the salmon back, bring the old trees back, and then our world will become healthier and more connected. So those are three things. Yeah.
And I'm sure there's lots more. Can I just talk a little bit more about carbon markets? Because they're fantastically complicated. And there are carbon markets around the world, but some work, some don't. Is it possible to create a price for carbon across the world when the world is so unequal? And ask poor countries to pay the same as rich countries? If you were designing a carbon market, how would it work?
Well, I think so. I'm not an economist, so this is not an easy question for me to answer. But I think that the market needs to allow the carbon price to fluctuate and to take on its own life. And I think that it needs to reflect the true value of carbon. So one way to think of the true value of carbon is, for one, what the damage of too much carbon in the air is causing. More severe hurricanes, floods in where I'm coming from, wildfires that are destroying communities. Those weigh into the real price of carbon. The other price of carbon is how does we restore those carbon pools? That needs to weigh into the real price of carbon. Right now it's way too low, right? You cannot restore a hectare of land on $13 a ton. It's got to be more like, $200 a ton, or even in some cases $1,000 a ton. So we need to get realistic about the price of carbon and let it fluctuate with the market, reflecting the true cost of restoring these systems or replacing, fossil fuel energy with green energy. And then I think that the industrialized nations need to pay more. Because we've put in, I include myself in here, of course, from Canada, we've emitted way more CO2 and greenhouse gases than equatorial and third world countries. We need to bear the cost of that. We need to make sure that we're, buying carbon offsets at the real price so that this system helps pay for itself and it lifts up societies so that they can actually go into the forest and do the work themselves with their local knowledge.
If you could change the world in one way, what would it be?
Well, I think what I've said, really is about valuing more than just what is making a lot of people wealthy at this time, but valuing our life support systems, putting a real price on that. And I think that once we do that, and it's reflective of, what we need to sustain life on this planet, that will change everything.
Professor Suzanne Simard, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your ways to change the world, and I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, then Please give us a rating or a review, and then other people will find this podcast. You can watch all of these interviews on the Channel 4 News YouTube channel. Our producer is Imahn Robertson. Until next time, bye-bye.